Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be uncovering the fascinating world of circadian rhythms. You know, those internal clocks that keep so many living things ticking. We're going to be using the humble fruit fly as our guide, and you might be surprised at how much they have in common with us when it comes to waking, sleeping, and everything in between.
It's true. They're incredible little creatures.
Yeah, think of this deep dive as a biology class, just without the tests.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so imagine a fruit fly waking up before dawn in a vineyard.
Okay.
It's not simply reacting to the first rays of sunlight. It's actually getting ready for the day before the light even hits.
Right.
It's like they have this built-in alarm clock.
Precisely. And this internal timing system called a circadian rhythm isn't unique to fruit flies.
Right.
It's found in almost every living organism, from bacteria to plants to humans.
Wow.
It's one of those core mechanisms that evolution has held on to for billions of years.
So even if you keep fruit flies in complete darkness, they still maintain a roughly 24-hour cycle of activity and rest.
They do.
That's dedication to a routine.
It is. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
This tells us that the circadian rhythm isn't just a response to the environment, it's truly an internal biological clock. And what's even more fascinating is that this clock isn't located in just one spot.
Okay.
The molecular machinery for keeping time is present in many, if not all, of the fly's cells.
Wait, so each individual cell in a fruit fly has its own little clock?
It does.
Wow.
It's like a whole network of tiny timekeepers all working together, but of course there needs to be some coordination, right?
Right.
And that's where clock neurons in the brain come into play.
Okay.
These specialized neurons act like a conductor, helping to synchronize the cellular clocks and orchestrate the fly's overall daily rhythm.
So we have all these individual cells keeping time, and then the brain acts like a conductor, making sure everyone is playing in sync. But how does the fly's internal clock actually get set to the right time? It's not like they're checking their watches, are they?
No, they're not checking their watches. For a fruit fly setting, the clock is all about light.
Yeah.
They actually have 3 systems for detecting light and making sure their internal time matches the external world.
3 systems.
Talk about redundancy.
Wow, that's impressive. So the first one is probably their eyes, right?
You got it. Fruit flies have those large compound eyes that we typically think of.
Right.
But they also have 3 smaller light-sensitive structures on top of their heads called ocelli.
Interesting.
All of these help them detect the presence or absence of sunlight.
So just like us, they're using their eyes to sense the sun. What about the other 2 systems?
The second system relies on a special light-sensitive molecule called cryptochrome, or cry for short.
Okay.
This molecule is found in specific neurons in the brain and is particularly sensitive to blue light. When cry absorbs light, it triggers a cascade of molecular events that ultimately reset the internal clock.
So blue light is basically like hitting the reset button for the fly's brain.
Exactly. And the third system is a bit of a mystery. It involves a small photoreceptor organ tucked away inside the fly's head. Scientists believe it might be a holdover from the larval stage, but it can still contribute to the fly's ability to synchronize its clock with the environment.
So even though it might not be the main player anymore, evolution kept it around just in case? It's like a backup system for the backup system.
Precisely. And what's amazing is that any one of these 3 systems can maintain the fly's circadian rhythm on its own.
Really?
It's a fantastic example of how nature builds in redundancy to make sure these essential processes keep running smoothly.
Okay, so the fly has a clock, and it's got multiple ways to set that clock.
Right.
But what about the actual clockworks? How does this whole system actually tick?
That's where we delve into the fascinating world of genes and proteins. Scientists actually discovered the mechanism of the circadian clock by studying mutant flies that had different rhythms.
Okay.
Some faster, some slower, some completely arrhythmic.
Interesting.
It's like they took the clock apart to see how all the gears fit together.
So by looking at what was broken in these mutant flies, scientists were able to piece together how the clock normally works. That's pretty clever.
It is. And what they found is a beautifully complex cycle of gene transcription protein interactions and feedback loops. Think of it like a carefully choreographed dance, where genes are turning on and off, creating proteins that interact with each other, all in a precise 24-hour rhythm.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this gene-protein dance, but it sounds pretty complicated.
It's a very elegant system. It's like a seesaw. On one side, you have genes being turned on, producing proteins.
Okay.
On the other side, those proteins are accumulating, eventually shutting those same genes off.
Okay.
This back and forth motion, like the seesaw, creates a delay that's crucial for generating that 24-hour rhythm.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the rhythm here. Genes get turned on, they make proteins, the proteins build up and turn the genes off, and then the whole process starts all over again.
Right.
But how does this molecular clock actually translate into the fly's behavior? How does it know when to wake up, when to sleep, when to forage for food?
That's where we meet another key player in this story, a neuropeptide called pigment dispersing factor, or PDF.
Yeah.
PDF acts as a messenger carrying time-related information from those clock neurons we talked about earlier to other parts of the brain.
So PDF is like the conductor's baton, signaling to the rest of the brain what time it is and what activities should be happening.
Exactly. And we know just how important PDF is because flies that lack this neuropeptide show some really interesting changes in their behavior.
Chance.
For example, they completely lose that ability to anticipate the morning light. They're still rhythmic, but they no longer wake up before the lights come on. It's like they've locked their internal alarm clock.
Wow. So PDF is essential for that anticipatory behavior. That's a pretty clear link between a molecule and a complex behavior.
It is.
But we also mentioned that there are different clock cells in the brain, morning cells and evening cells. How do they all work together to create the fly's overall daily schedule?
That's another place where PDF plays a crucial role. It helps keep all those different clock cells in the brain synchronized. It's like
Right.
a network of clocks all ticking at slightly different speeds.
Huh?
And PDF acts like a timekeeper, making sure they're all running in sync and coordinating their signals to the rest of the brain.
So PDF is not only transmitting information about the time of day, but also making sure that all the different clock cells are on the same page.
Yeah.
It really is like a conductor, making sure the whole orchestra is playing together.
It is a beautifully orchestrated system.
But how does all of this actually lead to the fly's rhythmic behavior?
Yeah.
How do genes and neurons translate into things like waking up, searching for food, or going to sleep?
That's a great question. And to understand it, we need to remember that the circadian clock isn't directly controlling specific behaviors.
Okay.
Instead, it acts more like a modulator, subtly adjusting the activity of other brain systems.
Think of it like this. You have all these different brain regions responsible for different behaviors, and the circadian clock is setting the overall tempo,
Okay.
making those behaviors more or less likely at certain times of day.
So it's not like there's a wake-up gene or a sleep gene. Instead, the clock is more like a dimmer switch, subtly adjusting the activity of various brain circuits throughout the day.
Exactly. And this modulation is incredibly widespread. Researchers have found that over 100 genes in the fly show circadian patterns of expression,
Wow.
suggesting that the clock's influence is pervasive. It affects a wide range of physiological processes and behaviors, from metabolism to hormone production to even learning and memory.
Really?
But perhaps one of the most striking examples of this circadian control is sleep.
Sleep. We've talked about activity and wakefulness, but now we're getting into the realm of rest. Do flies actually sleep?
They do. Of course, they don't sleep like we do. They don't curl up in a bed or close their eyes.
Right.
But they do exhibit characteristic changes in behavior and brain activity that indicate a sleep-like state.
They become inactive, less responsive to stimuli, and if you deprive them of sleep, they'll try to make up for it later, just like we do.
So even though they're not snoring away, they're still getting their Z's.
Mm-hmm.
But if sleep in flies is also under circadian control, what happens to their sleep patterns when their internal clock is messed up?
Well, mutant flies with disrupted clocks still sleep,
Okay.
but their sleep patterns are all over the place. They might sleep for short periods throughout the day and night, rather than consolidating their sleep into one long stretch like flies with a normal circadian rhythm. It's like their sleep schedule has become completely fragmented.
It sounds like a recipe for a very groggy fruit fly. So we've seen how this intricate clock system works in fruit flies.
Right.
But what about the bigger picture? How did these circadian rhythms evolve in the first place?
What's truly amazing is that circadian rhythms are incredibly ancient.
Hmm.
We find them in almost every living thing, from bacteria to plants to humans.
Wow.
And the basic clock mechanism, that seesaw-like cycle of genes and proteins, is remarkably similar across species.
It really points to just how fundamental these rhythms are to life itself.
So whether you're a human, a fly, or even a bacterium, you're relying on the same basic principles to keep time.
Exactly. And this suggests that the ability to synchronize with the day-night cycle was one of the very first adaptations in the history of life. In fact, some of the earliest cellular fossils resemble a type of bacteria that has circadian rhythms.
Wow.
It's like timekeeping is baked into the very essence of life.
Wow, that puts things into perspective. We often think of ourselves as separate from the natural world, but this just shows how deeply connected we are to even the smallest organisms. But if these clocks are so ancient and fundamental, have they stayed the same over millions of years? Or have they evolved to adapt to different environments?
That's where things get even more interesting. While the basic clock mechanism is conserved, it's not set in stone. Circadian rhythms have evolved and adapted to different environments over time.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of clock. There's room for variation and adaptation. Absolutely. And one of the best examples of this comes yet again from our friend, the fruit fly. Remember that period gene we talked about earlier?
Yes.
Well, it turns out there are different versions of this gene found in different populations of fruit flies around the world.
So just like there are different time zones, there are different versions of the clock gene.
In a way, yes. And what's really fascinating is that these different gene variants affect the fly's ability to compensate for temperature changes.
That makes sense. If you're a fly living in a tropical climate, you don't have to worry about huge swings in temperature. But if you're living in a more temperate climate, you need a clock that can keep accurate time even when it's cold or hot.
Precisely, scientists have observed something called a latitudinal climb,
Okay.
where different versions of the period gene are found in different climates. Flies living in colder climates, where temperatures fluctuate more, tend to have a version of the gene that's better at compensating for these changes. It's like they have a more robust all-weather clock.
So natural selection has favored those flies with the most accurate clocks, given their specific environment. It's amazing how even something as seemingly simple as a fruit fly can teach us so much about the complexities of evolution and adaptation.
It really is. And we've only just scratched the surface.
Right.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore what this research tells us about our own sleep cycles, the consequences of disrupting those rhythms, and how we might harness this knowledge to live healthier lives. Stay tuned.
All right, sounds good. It's incredible how much we can learn about ourselves by studying a tiny fly.
Mhm.
It's like they're holding up a mirror to our own biology.
It's true. And, one of the most compelling aspects of circadian rhythm research is its direct relevance to human health and well-being. We can learn a lot about ourselves by understanding how these rhythms work in other organisms.
Right, we all know sleep is important, but now I'm thinking about it from a molecular and evolutionary perspective.
Right.
So how similar are our internal clocks to those of a fruit fly?
That's where things get exciting. Remember those clock genes we talked about in the fly period timeless clock cycle? Well, we have those same genes or very close counterparts in our own cells.
So the basic machinery is the same, even after millions of years of evolution. That's mind-blowing.
It really highlights how fundamental these rhythms are to life itself. But of course, there are also some key differences between our clocks and those of a fruit fly.
I can imagine. Our lives are a bit more complex than a fruit fly buzzing around a fruit bowl. What kind of things affect our internal clocks?
Well, for one thing, our circadian rhythms are influenced by a wider range of factors. Light is still the primary time cue, but things like our work schedules, social interactions, and even what we eat can also affect our internal clocks.
So while the sun might be the master clock, our modern lifestyles can throw a wrench in the works.
Exactly. And that's where the potential health consequences come in. When our internal clocks are chronically misaligned with the external world, it can lead to a whole host of problems, like those you experience with jet lag.
So we're talking about things like jet lag and shift work, right? Those are classic examples of circadian disruption. But what kind of health problems can happen?
It goes beyond just feeling tired or groggy. Chronic circadian disruption has been linked to an increased risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and even certain types of cancer.
Wow, that's serious. So it's not just about getting enough sleep, it's also about making sure our sleep patterns are aligned with our natural rhythms.
Precisely. And this is where understanding the molecular mechanisms of the circadian clock becomes so important. If we can figure out how to adjust those mechanisms, we might be able to develop new therapies for sleep disorders, jet lag, and other circadian-related problems.
So this research isn't just about fruit flies and their fascinating little clocks. It has real implications for human health. What are some of the most promising areas of research?
One exciting area is the development of drugs that can target specific components of the circadian clock, for example. There are drugs in development that aim to enhance the production of melatonin, a hormone that plays a key role in regulating sleep.
So instead of just taking a sleeping pill, we might one day be able to take a pill that actually resets our internal clock.
Exactly. And researchers are also exploring ways to use light therapy to help realign our circadian rhythms, for example. There are special glasses that can filter out blue light, which we know can significantly impact our internal clocks.
So if you're spending a lot of time in front of screens at night, those blue light blocking glasses might help improve your sleep.
They could, of course, more research is needed, but the possibilities are really exciting. And beyond just treating sleep disorders, there's growing interest in using our knowledge of circadian rhythms to optimize other aspects of
Yeah.
our health.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for one thing, our circadian rhythms influence our metabolism. By understanding these rhythms, we might be able to develop more personalized approaches to weight loss or even diabetes management.
So instead of just focusing on what we eat, we could also pay attention to when we eat to better align with our internal clocks. That's fascinating. What else?
There's also evidence that the timing of certain medications can affect their efficacy and side effects. So by taking these circadian rhythms into account, we might be able to improve drug delivery and minimize negative side effects.
That's a game changer. So it's not just about sleep, it's about tailoring our entire approach to health and wellness around our internal clocks.
Precisely, and this is where the fruit fly continues to be such a valuable model organism. By studying these seemingly simple creatures, we gain insights into the fundamental mechanisms of the circadian clock that are relevant to all living things, including ourselves.
It's amazing that we can learn so much about ourselves from a fly buzzing around a piece of fruit. But this research also raises some important ethical questions, doesn't it?
It does. As we gain a deeper understanding of these rhythms and develop new ways to manipulate them, we need to carefully consider the potential consequences.
For example, what if we start using these technologies to enhance performance or productivity? Could we be messing with something fundamental to our biology?
Those are important questions. There are concerns about the potential for abuse, especially if these technologies become widely available. We need to have open and honest conversations about the ethical implications of this research as it develops.
It's a classic case of science moving faster than our ability to fully grasp the implications, but it's also a reminder of why this kind of research is so important. By understanding these rhythms, we're not just gaining knowledge, we're gaining the power to shape our own health and well-being in profound ways.
Absolutely. And as with any powerful tool, we need to wield it responsibly.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of circadian rhythms, explored their evolutionary history, and even delved into the potential implications for human health and ethics. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I'm curious about. We've talked about how these rhythms are essential for individual organisms, but what about their role in the larger ecosystem? How do circadian rhythms play out on a larger scale?
That's a great question, and it takes us into the fascinating realm of ecological interactions. It turns out that circadian rhythms aren't just important for individual organisms, they also shape the dynamics of entire ecosystems.
All right, so we've talked about how circadian rhythms work at the cellular and organism level, and even how they influence entire ecosystems.
Hmm.
Now we're going to zoom back in and talk about microevolution, those small changes in genes that can really add up over time. And we're sticking with fruit flies.
Our favorite little model organism.
What's the story here?
It's all about adaptation. Just like any other trait, circadian rhythms can evolve in response to environmental pressures, and a great example of this is the variation we see in the period gene across different populations of fruit flies around the world.
We talked about this earlier, those latitudinal clines where different versions of the gene are found in different climates.
Right.
Remind me, how does the period gene actually differ in flies from different climates?
It all comes down to a specific section of the period gene that has a repeating sequence of threonine and glycine amino acids. Okay. The length of that repeat can vary, and it turns out that this variation is linked to latitude and temperature.
So flies living in colder climates with more temperature swings tend to have a different version of the period gene than flies living in warmer, more stable climates.
Exactly. And that's not just a random coincidence. Scientists have actually demonstrated that these different versions of the gene affect the fly's ability to compensate for temperature changes.
Okay, I remember you mentioned temperature compensation before,
Yeah.
but why is it so important for a circadian clock?
Think about it. A biological clock is basically a series of chemical reactions happening in a precise order. And just like most chemical reactions, the speed at which they occur is affected by temperature.
So if it gets colder, the reactions slow down, and if it gets warmer, they speed up. But how does that affect the circadian clock?
Well, if those clock reactions are speeding up or slowing down because of temperature changes, it throws off the timing of the entire cycle. Imagine trying to keep track of time with a clock that runs faster when it's hot and slower when it's cold. It wouldn't be very accurate, would it?
That makes sense. So a fly living in a place with fluctuating temperatures needs a clock that can stay accurate even when the weather is changing.
Exactly. And that's where these different versions of the period gene come, and the variant found in flies from colder climates is better at compensating for temperature changes, making sure those chemical reactions keep ticking at the right speed no matter the temperature. It's like having a super reliable all-weather clock.
So natural selection has favored those flies with the all-weather clock in those colder climates. It's amazing how such a small change in a gene can make a big difference in survival.
It is. And remember, it's not just about surviving, it's
Hmm.
also about thriving.
Okay, so how does having a more temperature-compensated clock actually help a fly thrive?
Well, remember those anticipatory peaks of activity we talked about before, how flies wake up before dawn to get a head start on the day?
Yeah, those early birds get the worms, or in this case, the ripe fruit.
Exactly. Now imagine a fly living in a place where the timing of dawn changes throughout the year because of changes in day length.
So in the summer, the sun might rise earlier than in the winter.
Right now, a fly with a clock that's not well compensated for temperature might find itself waking up at the wrong time too early or too late and missing out on prime foraging hours.
It's like their internal clock isn't in sync with the environment anymore.
Exactly, but a fly with a more temperature compensated clock can adjust its internal timing more accurately, ensuring that it's always waking up at the optimal time no matter what the temperature or day length.
So it's like they have a built-in calendar that's perfectly calibrated to the changing seasons. It's a huge advantage.
It is, and it really underscores how these tiny genetic adaptations can significantly shape a species' success, but it also makes you wonder about how circadian rhythms evolved in the first place.
That's a great point. We know they're ancient and found in everything from bacteria to humans. But how did that very first clock evolve? And what kinds of environmental pressures led to it?
That's one of the big mysteries in this field.
Yeah,
It's hard to imagine life without these rhythms now.
right.
But at some point, they were a brand new adaptation, and scientists have a lot of hypotheses about how that might have happened. Some think that early life forms might have evolved circadian rhythms to protect themselves from the sun's harmful UV radiation.
So they'd be more active at night when the UV levels were lower and then lay low during the day.
Exactly. Others think that early clocks might have evolved to help organisms anticipate predictable changes in their environment, like tides or the availability of food.
So instead of just reacting to those changes,
Yeah.
they could prepare for them in advance. Pretty smart.
It is. And there's even evidence that early circadian rhythms might have been involved in the evolution of photosynthesis.
Wow, that's a big one. How could circadian rhythms have affected photosynthesis?
Well, photosynthesis needs sunlight, right? So having a clock that could anticipate the availability of sunlight might have given those early photosynthetic organisms an advantage. They could gear up their systems in advance, ready to capture that energy as soon as the sun came up.
It's incredible to think that something as essential to life as photosynthesis could be linked to the evolution of circadian rhythms.
Mhm.
It really shows how deeply connected everything is in the natural world.
It does, and it's amazing to consider how much we've been able to learn from such a tiny creature like the fruit fly who knew these little guys were such complex timekeepers.
Right. It just goes to show that you can find profound insights in the most unexpected places, from the intricate workings of a single cell to the grand symphony of ecological rhythms. Exploring circadian rhythms has been a fascinating journey. So the next time you see a fruit fly buzzing around, remember, it's not just a pest. It's a tiny marvel of evolution, carrying within it the secrets of life's ancient rhythms. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.